All right, so you're getting ready for that big senior software engineer interview, and let me tell you, we're about to give you a secret weapon. But I'm warning you, it's not about memorizing those tricky coding challenges. Today we are going deeper, like way deeper. We're uncovering what those super experienced interviewers really look for in a senior candidate.
Exactly. We're going to break down some serious wisdom from a true software guru, and they stress something you might not expect, maintainability.
Maintainability for an interview. I can practically hear you thinking, hold on, shouldn't I be like, brushing up on algorithms?
Yeah, it's funny, right? But that's where things get interesting. It's not just about getting your code to work, it's about building systems that can last for like years and years and years.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what does this, maintainability thing actually mean for someone like facing a tough interviewer?
So think about it. A senior engineer isn't just coding for today. They're building the foundation for like the entire future of the project. And that foresight, that ability to think long term, that's pure gold to any experienced interviewer.
So like they can spot that a mile away. Okay, I'm starting to see how this is different from just, coding up a solution.
Yeah.
So to really like nail this, we're going to break down maintainability into 3 core principles, and these come straight from our expert. Operability, simplicity, and evolvability. And trust me, understanding these will not only help you ace that interview, it'll make you a way better engineer, like, period.
Totally agree. So let's start with operability. You've nailed the code. It works perfectly in your little development environment. But then how does it actually perform in the real world? Can it handle the pressure, the unexpected hiccups, those dreaded like 3 a.m. alerts?
Oh man, those 3 a.m. alerts. It's like when you inherit a project and the code is just a tangled mess, no documentation, and suddenly that simple bug fix turns into a week-long expedition through the jungle of someone else's code.
Exactly. That's like the definition of poor operability.
Yep.
Our expert is really hammering this point home, Senior engineers don't just build things. They make sure those systems run smoothly, even when they're not around to babysit them. They build in robust monitoring from day one, thinking about things like application performance monitoring and tracking like actual user behavior.
So instead of just, crossing their fingers and hoping for the best, they're proactively setting up dashboards, alerts logs, things that give them a clear picture of the system's health. That's some serious senior level thinking right there.
Right. And we can't forget about documentation. Clear, concise, and up-to-date documentation. It's a lifesaver, not just for future developers, but for yourself a few months down the line, when you inevitably have to revisit that code.
I'm starting to see how this whole operability thing isn't just a technical skill. It's almost like a mindset shift, taking responsibility for the long-term well-being of your code.
Yeah, exactly. Thinking like an owner, not just a coder.
Yeah.
And interviewers can spot that a mile away. So when you're prepping for your interview, think about past projects where you went above and beyond. Did you implement detailed logging? Did you create that amazing documentation that saved the day? Those are the stories that will make you shine.
Those are things that make you stand out. That's awesome.
It is.
Okay, so we've tackled that whole operability thing.
Yeah.
But let's be real. Even the most, well-documented, perfectly monitored system can still be a total nightmare if the underlying code is just a tangled mess.
Oh, absolutely. Our expert has this great term for it, the dreaded big ball of mud. And let's face it, we've all encountered it at some point. That code base where even the smallest change feels like you're navigating a minefield.
Ooh, tell me about it. I once inherited this project where a single function was like hundreds of lines long with variables named after Greek gods and like these cryptic comments that only made things worse.
Oh my God. I can only imagine the horror. And that's why our expert's next principle, simplicity, it's so crucial. They argue that like a key weapon against this complexity is abstraction.
Okay, abstraction, that sounds a bit, abstract.
Right.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Think of it like this. When you're explaining a complex system to someone, you wouldn't go through every single line of code, right?
Right.
You'd use like higher level concepts, modules, and functions to paint a clear, understandable picture. That's abstraction in action.
So instead of getting lost in the weeds, you're creating a more manageable bird's eye view of the system?
Exactly. And this applies to everything, from designing APIs to choosing the right design patterns. A senior engineer knows how to strike that balance, between hiding unnecessary complexity, but also providing enough transparency for maintainability.
Okay, that makes sense. So in an interview, I guess it's not just about showing you can code. It's about showing you can design elegant, maintainable systems.
Yeah.
Using the right levels of abstraction.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get specific. Think back to your own experience. Have you ever refactored a messy piece of code into something more modular and understandable? Have you used design patterns to simplify complex interactions? Those are the kinds of stories that will really impress interviewers.
Yeah, because they show you're not just slinging code, you're thinking about the structure, the architecture, the long-term health of the system.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that you understand the power of simplicity. Now, while keeping things simple is crucial, we also have to acknowledge that in the world of software, change is inevitable. And that brings us to our expert's final principle, evolvability.
Oh yes, the dreaded shifting requirements. I'm pretty sure I've never worked on a project where the scope didn't change at least once. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
It really is. And that's where evolvability comes in. It's about anticipating those changes, building flexibility into your systems, and embracing the fact that software is a living, breathing thing.
So it's not just about coding for today. It's about anticipating tomorrow's challenges and building systems that can adapt.
Precisely. And while agile methodologies like sprints and stand-ups are valuable tools, evolvability goes beyond that. It's a mindset, a way of thinking about design and architecture that considers future flexibility from the outset.
Like thinking about how you might need to add new features or integrate with other systems down the line.
Exactly. Think about modular design, loose coupling, and well-defined interfaces. These are all principles that contribute to evolvability.
So in an interview, how can you showcase your evolvability skills?
Think about times when you had to refactor code to accommodate new features. Or maybe you anticipated a future need and designed your system in a way that made those changes easier to implement. Perhaps you even had to make a tough call to rewrite a part of the system to improve its long-term flexibility. Those are the kinds of stories that demonstrate you're not just coding for the moment, you're building for the future.
It's about showing that you're not afraid of change, but rather embracing it as a natural part of the software development lifecycle.
Absolutely. And that, my friend, is a quality that any senior engineer should have in their toolkit.
Wow, this has been so eye-opening. We've gone deep on operability, simplicity, and evolvability. And I'm really starting to see how these principles can make or break a system and a senior engineer's career.
Yeah, for sure. These concepts might seem kind of subtle compared to like mastering some crazy algorithm, but they are what separate the good engineers from the great ones.
So let's bring it all back to that interview you're prepping for.
Yeah.
How can you use these principles to really wow those interviewers?
Here's the key. Don't just walk in there and start reciting definitions and stuff. Instead, reflect on your own experiences through the lens of operability, simplicity, and evolvability.
So it's about telling the story of your career, but highlighting those moments where you really demonstrated these key principles.
Exactly. Think back to those challenging projects. Have you ever inherited a messy code base and made it way more maintainable? Did you design a system with future changes in mind? Maybe you solved some huge production issue that showed off your ability to keep things running smoothly.
Those are the stories that show you're not just a coder, but a true engineer who really gets it.
It's about showing them you understand the big picture, that you can build for the long haul, and that you're the kind of engineer who can not only solve problems, but also prevent them in the first place.
And honestly, even if you don't land this specific job, thinking this way will make you a much better engineer in the long run.
Absolutely. These principles are like gold. They'll be valuable throughout your entire career.
So to all you listeners out there, prepping for that big interview, remember, go beyond the code. Think about those stories that really showcase your ability to build those operable, simple, and evolvable systems. Those are the stories that will make you stand out. As a true senior engineer, good luck, you got this.
You got it. Best of luck.
That's a wrap for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.